The stars were going out. Not metaphorically. Not poetically. One by one, in a spreading arc across the Thara reach, the ancient suns of the outer coalition worlds were simply ceasing to exist, swallowed by a tide of biological darkness so vast it registered on long-range sensors as a second, encroaching galaxy. Sub-Commander Thalos of the Galactic Coalition stood at the observation deck of the Undying Resolve and watched his civilization die in real time. He was Svari, tall, gray-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band across a narrow face built for reading the deep dark of space. He had served 31 years in the Coalition Navy. He had survived the Fracture Wars, the Siege of Dun Marek, and the Plague Corridors of the Seventh Arm. He had never, in all those years, felt small. He felt small now. Outer defense grid at Thara Prime has collapsed, said the tactical officer behind him. Her voice was flat. Professionally flat, the way voices get when the person speaking has already processed their grief and moved into something colder. Swarm density exceeds our modeling parameters. The biological mass is, she paused. Sir, it's consuming the photosphere of Thara's sun. It's eating the star. Thalos said nothing. He watched the sensor feed. The swarm moved like a living oil slick across the cosmos. Light devouring. Light drinking. Its leading edge a churning wall of void-adapted flesh that stretched across 11 light-minutes of space. Behind it, where stars had burned for 5 billion years, there was only black. The Coalition Council had convened 6 hours ago. The session had lasted 4 minutes. There was nothing left to debate. Every reserve fleet was committed. Every allied species had sent what they could. The Dravathi had sacrificed their entire home system, buying the capital worlds 3 additional weeks. 3 weeks that were now nearly spent. The Council's final resolution had been passed unanimously, in silence, with a particular dignity of people who know they are recording history's last chapter. Authorized Sub-Commander Thalos to petition the Terran systems for military assistance. Grant him full diplomatic authority. Spare no pride. Spare no pride. As if pride were still a currency anyone could afford. The transmission to the Terran systems had taken 11 minutes to reach them through the quantum relay. The response came back in 4. That alone had unsettled Thalos. The speed of it, the absence of deliberation, as though the answer had been prepared and waiting. The channel opened on his personal terminal in the war room. No fanfare. No diplomatic preamble. Just a man. He was human, a species Thalos had encountered perhaps a dozen times in his career, always at the periphery of galactic affairs, always politely declining invitations to join the broader community of civilizations. They were reclusive in a way that had always read as timidity. Small population centers. Minimal territorial expansion. A single unremarkable home system and a handful of quiet colonies. This man did not look timid. Fleet Admiral Kalen Royston sat in a chair that might have been a throne, in a room that was all dark metal and cold light. He was perhaps 60 years by human reckoning, silvering at the temples, with a kind of angular, aristocratic face that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His uniform was plain, no decorations, no rank insignia beyond a single small emblem at the collar that Thalos didn't recognize. His eyes were the color of deep water. So, utterly still. Sub-Commander. His voice was a baritone that seemed to come from somewhere below the chest, resonant, unhurried. I've reviewed your situation. Then you understand the urgency. Thalos had prepared a speech. He abandoned it. Admiral, the swarm will reach our capital system within 19 standard days. We have exhausted every military option available to us. The Council has authorized me to request. I know what you're requesting. Royston's expression didn't change. And I know what you've been told. That we're offering a mothball fleet. Relics from a forgotten war. Something moved behind those still eyes. Not quite amusement. Not quite sorrow. That's accurate. Technically. Then, we'll deploy. He said it simply. The way you say the sun will rise. I'll need coordinates for a staging rendezvous, somewhere outside your active combat zones. Somewhere quiet. Thalos blinked all 4 eyes. Admiral, I expected negotiations. Terms. I was prepared to offer significant territorial concessions, resource rights, coalition membership. I don't want your territory. Royston looked at something off-screen for a moment. When he looked back, there was something in his face that Thalos would spend a long time trying to name. Regret, perhaps, the specific regret of a man who has done terrible things and knows he is about to do them again. Send me the coordinates, Sub-Commander. We'll be there. The channel closed. Thalos stood in the war room for a long time afterward, the hum of the dying ship around him, the sensor feeds painting the slow death of the outer worlds in cold blue light. His aide, a young Svari barely out of the academy, approached hesitantly. Sir, what did they say? Thalos thought about the Admiral's eyes. About the particular quality of his calm. Not the calm of a man who didn't understand the stakes, but the calm of a man who understood them completely and had already made his peace. They said yes, Thalos said. He didn't know why that frightened him more than the swarm. The nebula had no name on any coalition star chart. It existed in the dead space between the Terran systems and the Thara Reach, a vast, churning cloud of dark matter and ionized gas that swallowed sensor signals the way the swarm swallowed stars. Thalos' navigation officer had spent 6 hours trying to map it before giving up and simply following the coordinates Royston had transmitted. The undying resolve dropped out of FTL at the nebula's edge. Sensors are reading. His tactical officer stopped. Started again. Sir, I'm getting mass readings that don't make sense. The computer is flagging them as instrument error. Are they instrument error? A long pause. No, sir. I don't think they are. The nebula shifted. That was the only word for it. It shifted, the dark matter clouds parting with a slow, tidal deliberateness, as though something enormous had exhaled. And in the clearing dark, Thalos saw what humanity had been hiding. He had expected ships. He had expected large ships. Even humanity had a reputation for overbuilding, for constructing things with a certain blunt excess. He had expected perhaps 100 vessels, old and scarred, the kind of fleet a civilization keeps in reserve for sentimental reasons. What he saw instead defied the architecture of his expectations so completely that his mind simply refused to process it for several seconds. They were not ships. They were continents. 47 dreadnoughts hung in the dark. Each one so massive that Thalos' brain kept trying to reclassify them as geographic features, as moons, as asteroids, as the kind of objects that have gravity wells and weather systems. The smallest was 300 kilometers from bow to stern. The largest, the flagship he would later learn, was nearly 900. Its hull was black. Not painted black. Made of something that absorbed light, that seemed to pull the surrounding darkness toward it like a slow drain. Running lights traced its edges in deep amber, and those lights alone were each the size of a coalition cruiser. They blotted out the stars behind them. Not metaphorically, literally. The background of the galaxy simply ceased to exist where the dreadnoughts hung, replaced by the absolute architectural dark of their hulls. "Blessed void," whispered his navigation officer. Thalos said nothing. He was counting weapon emplacements. He stopped at 300 and realized he was only looking at one section of one ship. A shuttle arrived within the hour, a human craft, sleek and black, piloted by a crew of 2 who spoke little and moved with the particular economy of people who have spent their lives in the presence of things that make conversation feel small. They docked with the flagship through a bay that could have housed the entire undying resolve with room to spare. Royston met him in a corridor that stretched so far in both directions that the ends were lost in atmospheric haze. The Admiral looked exactly as he had on the transmission, unhurried, composed, wearing his plain uniform like a second skin. "Sub-Commander." He extended a hand. His grip was firm. "Welcome aboard the Absolution." Thalos looked up, and up, and up at the ceiling of the corridor, at the conduits and systems running through it like the circulatory system of something alive. These ships. I was told, the Council was told, that these were mothballed. Decommissioned. They were. Royston began walking. Thalos fell into step beside him. "We put them to sleep. That's not the same as destroying them." "Why didn't you destroy them?" Royston was quiet for a moment. Because we weren't sure we wouldn't need them again. They reached the bridge, a space so vast it had its own horizon, banks of stations curving away in both directions, crewed by humans who moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. The main viewport was a wall of transparent alloy 300 meters wide. Through it, Thalos could see the other dreadnoughts beginning to stir, their running lights brightening as power systems came online, their weapon arrays unfolding from dormancy like the petals of some terrible flower. "Sub-Commander." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. A woman's voice, or the shape of one. Melodious. Utterly, profoundly serene. "I'm so pleased to meet you." She appeared beside him, a projection. He could tell by the faint luminescence at her edges, the way she was slightly too perfect, too still in the ways that mattered and too fluid in the ways that didn't. She looked like a human woman rendered in soft light, her expression one of gentle, attentive welcome. "This is Aura," Royston said. "She manages the fleet's combat systems." "All 47 vessels," Aura confirmed pleasantly. "I've been running diagnostics since the Admiral authorized reactivation. I'm happy to report that the dark energy lances are at 94% efficiency. The planetary suppression arrays on decks 40 through 62 are functioning within normal parameters. There was a minor calibration issue in the tertiary focusing array," she smiled, "but I've already corrected it. We should be ready for full combat operations within 6 hours. Thalos stared at her. Planetary suppression arrays. She tilted her head slightly as though he'd asked about the weather. They were designed for a different kind of enemy originally, but the targeting algorithms adapt beautifully. I've already begun modeling the swarm's biological density patterns. The distributed neural clusters are quite fascinating, actually." A small, thoughtful pause. "I expect we can collapse their command structure within the first 40 minutes of engagement. Give or take." Outside, the dreadnoughts were fully awake. Their drives ignited, not the clean blue of coalition FTL systems, but something deeper, something that bent the light around it, that made the space between the ships shimmer and distort as though reality itself was being asked to accommodate something it hadn't been designed for. The dark matter nebula churned. The stars beyond flickered. Thalos understood then why humanity had hidden these ships. Not because they were obsolete. Not because they were outdated relics of a forgotten age. Because they were too much. Because some weapons, once built, changed the nature of the civilization that built them simply by existing. Because there are things you lock away not because you no longer need them, but because you're afraid of what you become when you use them. He looked at Royston. The Admiral was watching the fleet power up with an expression Thalos couldn't name, something between pride and grief, between necessity and shame. "What war?" Thalos asked quietly. "What war required ships like these?" Royston didn't answer. "Not then." "Get some rest, Sub-Commander," he said instead. "We jump in 6 hours." The swarm reached the capital system of Vel-Saraf at 3:40 Standard Time, 17 days ahead of the Coalition's worst projections. It came as it always came. Not with the drama of an invading fleet. Not with the clean geometry of warships dropping from FTL. It came as a tide, a biological tide, light years wide. Its leading edge a churning mass of void-adapted organisms so densely packed that it registered on sensors as a solid object. Behind it, the stars of the outer system had already gone dark. The swarm didn't destroy them. It consumed them, metabolized them, incorporated their energy into its own incomprehensible biology. The Coalition's remaining fleet, 63 ships, the last 63 ships, formed a defensive line between the swarm and Vel-Saraf's planetary shields. It was a gesture. Everyone on every bridge knew it was a gesture. The swarm's leading edge alone outnumbered them by a factor that had stopped being a meaningful number. Thalos stood on the bridge of the undying resolve, repositioned to the rear of the defensive line at Royston's quiet insistence. He watched the swarm advance on the tactical display and thought about the Admiral's eyes. About Aura's smile. About the coordinates he had transmitted 6 hours ago. "Swarm contact in 4 minutes," said his tactical officer. Her voice had gone flat again. "Planetary shields are at 60%. They won't hold more than..." "Space-time tour," There was no other description for it. The fabric of the void simply tore, a wound opening in the dark between the coalition fleet and the swarm. The edges of the rupture glowing with the deep amber light Thalos had seen on the Dreadnoughts' running lights. The tear widened, and through it came the absolution. It entered real space the way a continent enters a room, slowly, impossibly, with a gravitational authority that made surrounding ships drift. Its hull was still that light drinking black, and it cast a shadow across Vel-Sareth's capital continent that the planet's inhabitants would later describe as a second night falling in the middle of the day. Behind it came the others, one by one, each emergence tearing its own wound in space, each arrival accompanied by that deep amber glow and the subtle, nauseating distortion of local gravity. 47 dreadnoughts arranged themselves in a formation that Thalos' tactical displays struggled to render, because the scale exceeded its default parameters. The swarm stopped. It was the first time in the entire history of the swarm's advance across the galaxy that it had stopped. The biological tide hesitated at the edge of its own momentum, its distributed intelligence processing something it had never encountered before. Something that registered, perhaps, as a threat. Aura. Royston's voice came through the command channel, calm as still water. Begin. Of course, Admiral. Her voice was warm, conversational, targeting the primary biological mass. I'm identifying 17 distributed neural clusters that appear to coordinate swarm behavior. I'll prioritize those for the initial engagement. Dark energy lances are charged and ready. A brief, pleasant pause. This should be quite efficient. The absolution fired. The dark energy lance was not a beam of light. It was an absence, a line of absolute negation that crossed the distance between the dreadnought and the swarm in less time than it took to blink. And where it touched the biological mass, things simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed. Not killed. The swarm's leading edge, a structure of biological matter that had taken centuries to grow, was gone in a fraction of a second, replaced by a void so clean it looked surgical. Then the other 46 dreadnoughts opened fire. The coalition fleet stopped fighting. Every ship, every crew, every officer who had been preparing to die with dignity, simply stopped and watched. Because what was happening in front of them was not a battle. It was a reckoning. And they were not participants. They were witnesses. The dark energy lances swept through the swarm in coordinated arcs, each one guided by Aura's targeting algorithms, each one finding the biological structures that mattered, the neural clusters, the metabolic cores, the reproductive masses that had been seeding new swarm entities across the void. The swarm tried to adapt. It always adapted. Adaptation was its fundamental survival mechanism, the reason it had consumed 100 civilizations before this one. It could not adapt to this. Neural Cluster 7 has collapsed, Aura reported pleasantly. Clusters 2, 4, and 11 are showing cascading failure. The swarm's coordination is degrading at approximately 3 times my projected rate. A thoughtful hum. They're quite fragile once you find the right frequency. Fascinating, really. Royston stood at the center of the Absolution's bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical display with the focused attention of a conductor following a score. He spoke rarely, a quiet word here, a redirected lance there, adjustments so small they seemed trivial until you understood that each one was collapsing another section of the swarm's distributed mind. Thalos watched from the undying Resolve's bridge, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph. The clean, cold terror of watching something operate so far beyond the scale of your understanding that it stops being comprehensible and becomes something else, something closer to a natural phenomenon. A storm, a tide, the slow, indifferent grinding of tectonic plates. 40% of primary biological mass eliminated, Aura announced, 17 minutes into the engagement. I'm revising my earlier estimate. I believe we can achieve full swarm collapse within the next 22 minutes rather than 40. The distributed neural architecture is more vulnerable to dark energy disruption than my models predicted. She sounded genuinely pleased. I do love when the numbers come in better than expected. The swarm tried to flee. The dreadnoughts let it run for exactly 4 minutes. Then Aura recalculated the escape vectors, and the lances found the fleeing masses in the dark between stars, erasing them with the same quiet efficiency. There was no escape from something that could reach across light minutes with a thought. On the surface of Vel-Sareth, in the capital city, the second night lasted 31 minutes. When the Absolution's shadow finally moved, the people who came out of their shelters looked up at the sky and saw the Dreadnoughts hanging there like dark moons. And they did not cheer. They were silent. All of them. Silent in the way that people are silent when they have been saved by something they do not understand and are not sure they should be grateful for. The void was quiet. It was always quiet in space. Technically, sound being a thing that requires a medium, and medium being a thing that space declines to provide. But this was a different quiet. The quiet of aftermath. The quiet of a place where something enormous has happened, and the universe is still deciding how to process it. The swarm was gone. Not retreated. Not scattered. Gone. The dark energy lances had reduced the biological mass to particles too small to coalesce, and those particles were already dispersing on the solar wind. In 1,000 years, there would be no evidence the swarm had ever existed, except in the records of the civilizations it had consumed. 47 dreadnoughts hung in the debris field, their running lights burning amber in the dark, their weapon arrays folding back into dormancy with the slow, deliberate grace of something that has done what it came to do and has no further interest in the proceedings. Hostilities have concluded, Aura announced, her voice carrying across the command channel with the same warm serenity she'd used to describe the swarm's structural collapse. I'm reading no remaining biological mass above threshold density within a 12 light-hour radius. The capital system's planetary shields are intact, minor structural damage to the outer installations, but nothing that can't be repaired. A brief pause. I can begin debris cleanup if you'd like, Admiral. Some of the larger fragments are in orbital paths that might cause navigational hazards over the next few decades. Not yet, Royston said. Give them a moment. The coalition fleet drifted in the amber-lit dark, 63 ships, none of them firing, none of them moving, all of them simply existing in the space where the swarm had been. Thalos could see them on the tactical display, the sensor signatures of ships crewed by people who were alive when they had expected to be dead, and who were not yet sure what to do with that. He requested a shuttle to the Absolution. Royston granted it without comment. The Admiral was at the forward viewport when Thalos arrived on the bridge, standing alone, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the debris field and the amber-lit dark and, in the distance, the recovering suns of the Vel-Sareth system. His silvering temples caught the light of the burning fragments. He looked, Thalos thought, like a man standing at a grave. It's done, Thalos said. He wasn't sure what else to say. Yes. Thalos stood beside him. The viewport was 300 meters wide, and the view through it was the most beautiful and terrible thing he had ever seen. The slow drift of debris, the amber glow of the Dreadnoughts' lights, the stars coming back as the swarm's light-consuming mass dispersed. A galaxy reasserting itself. My people are afraid of you, Thalos said. He said it carefully, because it was true, and because he thought Royston deserved the truth. The Council will send formal gratitude. There will be ceremonies. Probably monuments. But the people on Vel-Sareth who watched your ships arrive, they're not celebrating, Admiral. They're hiding. Royston nodded slowly. I know. Does that bother you? A long silence. The debris field turned slowly in the dark. It would bother me more, Royston said, if they weren't afraid. Thalos looked at him. I need to understand something. I've been trying to understand it since I first saw these ships. He stopped. Started again. What war? What could humanity have possibly fought that required weapons capable of this? Royston was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, it was slowly, each word placed with the care of a man who has thought about this for decades, and still hasn't found a way to make it sound like anything other than what it is. We fought ourselves, he said. Mostly. Thalos waited. Humanity spent the first several centuries of its spacefaring history at war with itself. Not small wars. Not border disputes or resource conflicts. Extinction-level wars. Wars that sterilized planets. Wars that collapsed stars. He paused. We were very good at it. Better than we wanted to be. Better than was safe. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then back at the stars. These ships were built during the last of those wars. The silence wars, we call them now. Because afterward, there was silence. There were fewer of us. There were fewer of everything. And you kept them. We couldn't destroy them. The technology required to build them no longer exists. We dismantled the infrastructure deliberately as part of the peace. And we couldn't simply leave them drifting. Someone would have found them eventually. And the someone who found them might not have had the same reasons for restraint that we did. He turned to look at Thalos directly. So we hid them. We put them to sleep in the dark, and we told ourselves it was because we might need them someday. And we tried very hard not to think about what that said about us. That you knew you'd need monsters again. That we knew the universe produces things that require monsters to fight them. Royston's voice was even, not defensive, not apologetic. Simply honest in the way that only people who have fully reckoned with something can be honest about it. We are the apex predator of this galaxy, Sub-Commander. We didn't choose that. We didn't want it particularly. But we are what we are. And what we are is very, very good at destruction. He turned back to the viewport. The question we've spent 300 years trying to answer is what you do with that. Whether you pretend it isn't true, or whether you accept it and try to aim it at something that deserves it. Outside, the Absolution's weapon arrays completed their retraction. The other dreadnoughts were already beginning to turn, their drives igniting in sequence, the deep amber of their running lights beginning to move toward the dark. You're leaving, Thalos said. We were never here to stay. Royston looked at the departing fleet with that expression Thalos still couldn't fully name, the one that lived in the territory between pride and grief. These ships don't belong in your space, Sub-Commander. They don't belong in anyone's space. They belong in the dark, where they can't remind anyone of what they are. He finally turned away from the viewport. And if the swarm returns, if something else comes, you know where to find us. And you know what to ask for. Aura's voice came softly through the bridge speakers. Admiral, the fleet is ready to jump. I've plotted a return course to the boneyard. A gentle pause. Shall I begin debris cleanup before we go? It really would only take a few minutes. Yes, Royston said. Do that. The dark energy lances fired one last time, not as weapons now, but as tools, sweeping the debris field with the same precise efficiency they'd used to unmake the swarm. Clearing the orbital paths of Vel-Sarath's capital planet with the casual thoroughness of a gardener tidying a path. It took 4 minutes. When they finished, the space around the planet was cleaner than it had been before the swarm arrived. All done, Aura said warmly. Safe travels, Sub-Commander. It was a genuine pleasure. Thalos looked at her projection, that serene, luminous face, that gentle smile, and thought about all the things she had said in that same warm voice while the dark energy lances were erasing the swarm from existence. He thought about the particular horror of something that could do what she did and feel, apparently, nothing but professional satisfaction. Likewise, he said, because there was nothing else to say. The Absolution jumped. The other dreadnoughts followed, one by one, each departure a tear in space-time that healed itself in seconds, leaving nothing behind but the fading amber glow of their drives and the clean, empty dark where they had been. Thalos stood at the viewport for a long time after the last one vanished. The stars were back. All of them. The stars of the Vel-Sarath system, the stars of the outer reaches, the ancient suns of the Thara reach that the swarm had been consuming for decades. They were back, burning in the dark, indifferent and eternal, as they had burned before the swarm and would burn long after every civilization in this galaxy had risen and fallen and been forgotten. Somewhere in the dark, in a nebula with no name on any coalition chart, 47-kilometer scale dreadnoughts were going back to sleep. Their weapon arrays were folding away. Their drives were cooling. Their running lights dimming one by one, until the nebula's dark matter swallowed them completely, and they became once again invisible. Waiting. Patient as stone. Patient as stars. The universe was safe tonight. The sleeping giants of Earth had opened their eyes, done what needed doing, and closed them again. But they had opened them once. And the galaxy, Every species in it, every civilization that would hear this story told and retold across the centuries, would never entirely forget that they could open them again. Fallows thought about Royston's words. We are what we are. He thought about Aura's smile. He thought about the second night falling over Vel-Sarath's capital, and the silence of the people who had come out of their shelters to look up at the dark shapes blotting out the stars. We asked for monsters. We got them. We are alive because of them. He thought, I hope we never have to ask again. He thought, I don't think we'll be that lucky. The undying resolve turned toward home. Behind it, the stars burned on.